Historian Page Smith writes the following, and I quote, "We might begin our consideration of American history with John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, because the Protestant Reformation was the essential precondition of British colonial America. But John Winthrop's model of Christian charity will do as well." End quote. Welcome to the Monty Collier Report. I'm Monty Collier. In this opening segment of the report, we're going to be discussing the fourth branch of philosophy, political thought. Hope you guys enjoy this.
Socrates, the only true wisdom consists in knowing that you know nothing.
That's us, dude.
Oh yeah. Philosophize with it.
All we are is dust in the wind, dude.
Okay, in this segment of Christian philosophy, we're going to be discussing the political thought of the Bible and how biblical Christianity led to the creation of the United States government, the constitutional democratic republic that we have. The Bible teaches a complete philosophy, a complete philosophic system, and the Bible warns us to stay away from secular philosophy, but at no point are we told that biblical philosophy is wrong. In fact, we are encouraged to not only study it, but master it. And so that's what we're going to be discussing today, is how biblical Christianity, Calvinism, led to the creation of the United States government. Let me begin with a quotation from Calvinist Dr. John W. Robbins. In his book, Freedom and Capitalism, he writes the following, and I quote, "The Old Testament, in particular the book of 1 Samuel, is the oldest textbook in political freedom. Absent from its pages are the communism of Plato, the fascism of Aristotle, and the democratic totalitarianism of Rousseau. Written about 1000 BC, the book of 1 Samuel may be the first handbook in Republican political theory. God established a model government in ancient Israel, and it is the only government for which he gave explicit rules. While many of those rules applied solely to ancient Israel, cities of refuge, for example, others apply to all governments. The judicial laws of Israel expired with that nation, but it is possible to discern general principles in the Old Testament laws that may be applied to modern governments." End quote. That's from Freedom and Capitalism, page 30. Notice Robbins talks about how the judicial laws of Israel expired. Robbins is not teaching theonomy. Theonomy, especially postmillennial reconstructive theonomy, is a heresy. Dr. Robbins continues, quote, "As for the form of government, God established a republic in Israel. The nation was divided into 12 tribes, much as the United States is divided into 50 states. Each tribe had its own territory and border. Each had its own local government, and the nation as a whole had a national government. There was no king. There was no powerful central government. The government consisted mostly of judges. There was no legislature to create new laws each year. Only judges to settle disputes in accord with the laws that God had already given. There was no standing army. There was no military draft or national service. Education was not a function of government, but of parents, schools, and synagogue. Charity was handled privately. Taxes were extremely low. Money, gold and silver, was provided by private merchants, not by the government. The remarkable thing about this political arrangement is that it apparently was unique in ancient times, at least in the Middle East. This very uniqueness became an objection to it during the time of the prophet Samuel. The people of Israel rebelled against their model government. The story is told in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 through 18. End quote. Again, that was from Freedom and Capitalism, pages 30 through 31. I'm going to go ahead and read you the passage that Dr. Robbins referred us to. The Bible says, quote, "And it came to pass, when Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abiah. They were judges in Beersheba, and his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre, and took bribes, and perverted judgment. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together, and came to Samuel unto Ramah. And they said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us, like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel, when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me and served other gods. So do they also unto thee. Now therefore hearken unto their voice, howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked of him a king. And he said, This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons, and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. And he will appoint his captains over thousands, and captains over fifties, and will set them to ear his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war, and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries, and to be cooks, and to be bakers. And he will take your fields, and your vineyards, and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, and give to his officers and to his servants. And he will take your men servants, and your maidservants, and your goodliest young men, and your asses, and put them into his work. He will take the tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. And ye shall cry out in that day, because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day." End quote. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 through 18. Dr. Robbins, commenting on that passage, states, quote, "In Augustinian terms, big government is both the result of and the punishment for sin. God's warning against monarchy makes it clear that God despises all earthly monarchies. But God's warning was directed at more than monarchy. It is a warning against big government generally, a warning of what happens when God's model government, a republic of limited powers, is rejected. Rather than the governors being servants of the people become servants of the governors. The American notion that government ought to be the servant of the people, not exercise dominion over them, may be traced directly to 1 Samuel 8 and Luke 22. Let me now just read the verses Dr. Robbins was referring to out of Luke chapter 22. The verses are 24 through 26. The Bible says, quote, "And there was also a strife among them, which of them should be accounted the greatest. And he said unto them, The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and they that exercise authority upon them are called benefactors. But ye shall not be so. But he that is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he that is chief, as he that doth serve." End quote. Again, it was Luke 22, verses 24 through 26. Let me take a moment and just point out that the biblical political thought that we are discussing completely contradicts many of the heretical movements that are dominating so-called Protestant churches today. What we are teaching here contradicts movements like Lordship Salvation, postmillennial theonomic reconstructionism, federal vision, and of course, dominion theology.
Brace yourselves, amigos.
Gentlemen, we're history.
When it comes to the origin of the United States of America, one need not limit himself to Calvinist writers. There are many secular writers who also understand the important contribution of the Protestant Reformation, especially the conservative branch of the Protestant Reformation. Many secular writers understand the importance of Calvinism in the formation of this country. Let's take a look at some of these writers. In his first chapter, a chapter titled The Founding Fathers, An Age of Realism, Richard Hofstadter writes the following, and I quote, "Long ago Horace White observed that the Constitution of the United States is based upon the philosophy of Hobbes and the religion of Calvin. It assumes that the natural state of mankind is a state of war, and that the carnal mind is at enmity with God. The men who drew up the Constitution in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787 had a vivid Calvinistic sense of human evil and damnation, and believed, with Hobbes, that men are selfish and contentious." End quote. Page 5. That was taken from The American Political Tradition and the Men Who Made It. In his book, Dissenting Opinions, historian Page Smith writes the following: "The Protestant Reformation was such a movement of reform within the Christian church. It proved to be the most radical reforming of the church in its long history." Arnold Toynbee has written that the American Revolution was made possible by American Protestantism. That, very simply, is the assumption on which this essay is based. The assumption is perhaps best stated as proposition. The Protestant Reformation produced a new kind of consciousness and a new kind of man. The English colonies of America, in turn, produced a new and unique strain of that new consciousness. It thus follows that it is impossible to understand the intellectual and moral forces behind the American Revolution without understanding the role that Protestant Christianity played in shaping the ideals, principles, and institutions of colonial America. The American Revolution might thus be said to have started, in a sense, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg. It received a substantial part of its theological and philosophical underpinnings from John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, and much of its social theory from the Puritan Revolution of 1640 through 1660, and perhaps less obviously from the Glorious Revolution of 1689. Put another way, the American Revolution is inconceivable in the absence of that context of ideas which have constituted radical Christianity. The leaders of the Revolution in every colony were imbued with the precepts of the Reformed faith. Even though in many specific instances Christian orthodoxy was modified by Enlightenment ideas, there was a kind of irreducible stratum of Christian doctrine that were shared by colonists of all denominational persuasions, or none at all. When Luther made his dramatic gesture of defiance in 1517, he did more than attack specific abuses in the Roman Church. He struck at some of its basic dogmas. He insisted, for instance, that a man or woman could find salvation only through faith. And, perhaps most significant in its effect on the settlers of the New World, Luther held that the individual was wholly responsible for his own salvation. If Luther was the originator of the Reformation, John Calvin was its most formidable theorist. In his Institutes, Calvin presented the doctrinal basis of the branch of the Reformation that, as Calvinism, became the foundation of American Puritanism. The Institutes was, in effect, the charter for a new kind of consciousness, a new way of looking at the world and one's fellows, as well as a new way of understanding the relationship of the individual to the divine. End quote. Pages 14 and 15. In another book by Page Smith, a book titled The Constitution, a Documentary and Narrative History, Smith points out how Calvin's Institutes influenced the American colonists to resist the tyrannical powers of the British government. I'll read you a passage from this book. Smith writes the following, and I quote, "Therefore the Christian must be actively involved in the affairs of what the Mayflower Compact called the civil body politic. Perhaps most notably, Calvin rejected the monarchical government because it concentrated too much power in the hands of a fallible man, and came down on the side of a mixed aristocracy and democracy, where the many retained the means to check any improper, i.e. unconstitutional, exercise of power by the governors. There is another sentence in the Institutes to which we should be especially attentive. If a mixed form of aristocracy and democracy is the government which best guarantees the liberties of the people, it then follows that if the people exert their strenuous and constant efforts for its preservation and retention, They act in perfect consistence with their own duty. This sentence, perhaps more than any other, provided the American colonists, inheritors of Calvin, with their rationale for resisting what they considered the unconstitutional encroachments of the British government on the liberties of Englishmen living in America. End quote. Again, that was from his book, The Constitution, a Documentary and Narrative History, pages 34 through 35. This last quotation from Page Smith's book points us to the doctrine of lesser magistrates, which was taught by both Lutherans and Calvinists during the Protestant Reformation. For an excellent book that goes into great detail on the doctrine of lesser magistrates, so that you can understand that the War for American Independence was not a civil rebellion, some ungodly exercise, some sinful activity. We have some people today who claim that the War of American Independence was a sin, and that our founding fathers should not have fought the tyranny of Great Britain. Lordship salvation proponents, for example, Tim Conway teaches this. Also, so-called Reformed Church, the Protestant Reformed churches, the entire denomination, they will often teach that the American Revolutionary War was a sin. They are completely wrong. This shows that they do not understand the Calvinist doctrine of lesser magistrates. Like I was saying, if you want to get a book that completely explains that teaching, I would recommend you to Confessional Lutheran David Mark Whitford. His book Tyranny and Resistance, the Magdeburg Confession, and the Lutheran Tradition does an excellent job explaining that. Let's go ahead and look at a writer, more recent writer, who points us to Presbyterianism and Calvinism as one of the founding sources of the United States government. Derriman McCullough, in his book The Reformation, A History, speaking of Zwingli and the Swiss Reformation, writes the following, and I quote, "Majority voting was a new idea in communities which had previously made decisions by reaching consensus. It was also an obviously useful device for overcoming traditionalist minority obstruction. Zwingli extended the principle by organizing territorial assemblies, including both clergy and lay delegates, who would make common decisions on worship for the parishes of each territory. He thus created the first evangelical church synod, which in many later, more fully developed Reformed systems form part of a tiered structure of such decision-making bodies, some alternatively called presbyteries. This was a precedent of huge significance, not just for Reformed churches throughout the world, but for the shape of Western political life generally. Often the English point complacently at their mother of parliaments as the source of Western democratic ideals. They forget that by modern standards there was nothing especially democratic about their parliamentary system for most of its history, whereas the synodical representative form of church government in Reformed Christianity was much less inclined than English parliamentarians to show deference to the established hierarchy in society. The synodical model was of particular importance when, after 1776, the leadership in the fledgling United States of America drew on its own experience of Reformed churches in creating its new forms of government." End quote. Of course, in a segment like this, I cannot be exhaustive. The subject is simply vast. I could, for example, discuss how many historians, both Calvinist and secular historians, have referred to the American Revolution as a Presbyterian rebellion. I could discuss how the only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence was a Presbyterian named John Witherspoon. I could discuss how the Presbyterians in the Carolinas, with their Mecklenburg resolutions, anticipated the War for American Independence by 100 years at least. Pretty interesting material. I do hope this encourages you to study history and church history, and especially biblical Christianity. God bless.
Put that one on the Psyco-list.
That's right, Johnny. It's time for the Psyco-list.
Cain was the first envier. He could have offered a sacrifice equal to that of Abel, or offered a sacrifice that was from a pure heart. Instead, he murdered his brother because of his success.
Making the Psycho-list this week is Gary DeMar of American Vision. Gary DeMar is a post-millennial theonomic reconstructionist. DeMar is a Dominion theologian. He teaches Dominion theology. DeMar claims to be Reformed when he is not teaching Pelagianism, as you have just seen. DeMar is a supporter of the Federal Vision heresy, which he helped to create along with his heretical mentors Cornelius Van Til and Greg Bahnsen. As you can see, the quote from DeMar denies Calvinism. It rejects original sin, total depravity, and total corruption. DeMar's words assert that fallen man has a free will capable of obeying God's law. DeMar's Pelagianism is a complete rejection of justification by faith alone. Cain was a reprobate. He never had a pure heart, and he was unable to worship God correctly. He was wicked, and now he is in hell. The Bible says, quote, "The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord," end quote. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 8. Again, the Bible says, quote, "The thoughts of the wicked are an abomination to the Lord," end quote. Proverbs 15, verse 26 this time. Notice the Bible never describes the wicked as being able to do anything from a pure heart. Gary DeMar is simply out of his mind. Rather than go think a rich person like DeMar would have us to do, I think I will end this segment by simply saying Soli Deo Gloria.